You're live with BBC News. Now, President Biden has thanked the European Union for throwing a financial lifeline to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. A $54 billion package has finally been approved after being held up for months because of objections from Hungary. Now, though, the EU has unanimously passed the deal, which comes as US military aid for Ukraine. That's the largest provider of military support for Kyiv, is being held up by Congress. EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen said the funding sends a powerful message to the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin.
Today is indeed a very special day. The European Council reconfirmed Europe's unwavering commitment to stand with Ukraine. We all know that Ukraine is fighting for us, so we will support them with the necessary funding and provide them with the much-needed predictability they deserve. And I think these 50 billion euros for 4 years also send a very strong message to Putin, just ahead of the second anniversary of his brutal invasion.
Let's talk now to Jacob Kirkegaard, who's Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. That's a think tank. Jacob, thank you for being with us. And it's 50 billion. It sounds like a lot of money, but is it enough?
No, I mean, it's certainly not enough. It will cover part of the annual budget deficits for Ukraine. It will clearly need to be topped off by other financial assistance, both from other EU institutions, the European Investment Bank, bilaterally by EU members, other members of the G7. But I do think it does signal that the EU is aware of the basic fact that now that Ukraine has become an EU accession country, that it is overwhelmingly the financial task of the EU to support the Ukrainian economy.
What the opposition from Hungary and Viktor Orban ended up looking like, because he was calling, wasn't he, for a review of this funding every year. Instead, the compromise is that it will be discussed every 2 years. Is that enough certainty for Ukraine that potentially in 2 years this funding could change or disappear?
Well, I think if you read the fine print of the actual council conclusions, you will see that Viktor Orban got nothing. Any decision to adjust or suspend the payments have to be taken by qualified majority in the EU Council, which means that Viktor Orban does not have a veto. And if there's one thing we have seen in the last couple of weeks and months, is that the other 26 nations are very firmly united in backing Ukraine. So Viktor Orban got nothing. He folded. He got to be the center of attention for a few weeks. But in the end, he leaves having lost the battle.
As you said, European leaders agreeing to open EU membership talks, haven't they, with Ukraine? That'll start, we're told, in December. That's been discussed, hailed as a victory. But I wonder where it still leaves EU leaders when it comes to providing weapons and military hardware to Ukraine, because that is when it starts to get much more complicated, and there is not a unanimous view on how that should be delivered and what sort of weapons should be delivered.
No, I mean, it's very clear that there are different capabilities. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that the European, if you like, military-industrial complex, when the war broke out in 2022, was at a very, inadequate state. But one of the things that actually did also come out of today's summit was I would argue, political commitment among the EU leaders, details to be finalized before the next council meeting in March, of a $20 billion euro common fund for providing military aid to Ukraine in the coming years. And that, of course, will then be supplemented by what are bilateral commitments of military aid. So while the EU certainly is in no position to replace the military assistance provided by the United States and others, in the short run, I think it does signal that the European leaders are also getting more serious when it comes to common decisions, also on military aid.
Jacob, stay with us. I just want to bring in the panel. Rena and Peter still with us. And Peter, what does it tell us that finally there was a unanimous vote that all members of the EU agreeing to provide this support over 4 years? is quite a breakthrough.
It's quite a breakthrough, and it shows that amongst Viktor Orban's many talents, he can get the EU leaders to more or less agree on exactly the same page, which is not something they get to do particularly often. The whole summit was very, very interesting because the folding by Viktor Orban, when it happened really, really quickly. There's been this build-up of weeks and weeks and weeks of him threatening to block it, and in response, officials in Brussels briefing newspapers about the various things that they could do, including withholding EU money, threatening various other kind of...
Yeah, Peter, there was a sense, wasn't there, that he was told he had to pick a side. Is it Russia or is it the EU?
Well, I think he decided which side his bread was going to be buttered on, and he decided there was nothing that he could do. But the quotes that colleagues of mine who were there were kind of picking up from other EU leaders, they were quite scathing. They were basically saying, Viktor Orban has been a complete pain. We didn't have to do this. We could have done this weeks and weeks ago. We're glad he's finally given up, but he's put us through a lot of pain for absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and Rina, there will be certainly an eye, though, won't there, as well, from President Zelensky of Ukraine, looking at what's happening around the world with elections coming up, and 4 years buys him a bit of certainty when there may be anything but certainty in world politics.
I look at this situation with Orban, and I've been concerned for a number of years about his outsized influence here within these United States on the American right. They love him. They want to follow what he's laid out, his plan. I mean, when he first came to politics, essentially, he wasn't much of an ideologue. And now look at him. He's found a playbook. He's almost said he's built it, and they came. And so what I'm really concerned about is Orban's longevity, really the effect of his message and how it's made its way across oceans over here to these United States. That's something we ought to pay close attention to. Anybody who's concerned about authoritarians, dictators, any of that, and really essentially extremism ought to be paying attention to Orban.
Yeah, and Jacob, I mean, you're nodding along to that. And I wonder, a final thought from you, though, how President Putin will view all of this. Sitting there in Moscow, what will he make of not only that funding and where that money will be spent, but also that unanimity amongst EU leaders?
No, I mean, it's a major setback for him. There's no doubt about that. He has failed in that. I mean, there's no doubt that he would have wanted Viktor Orban to continue his vetoes. But as was said just now, Orban chose the side that can provide him with more economic rents. And that's very clearly the EU. And now, obviously, the Russian government and Vladimir Putin will have to wait for the decision of the American people to see if they can actually split the otherwise, I would argue, still quite firm Western support for Ukraine.
Jacob, it's been good to have you with us. That's Jacob Kirkegaard, there, Senior Fellow at GMF, a think tank, joining us there live. There's so much more for us to talk about on the programme, and we'll have the panel with us throughout the rest of the evening. But stay with us. You're watching The Context here on BBC News.